JAM session. You have joined ISBM. I hope that's where you wanted to go today. And our JAM session on the supply chain debacle that we have going on today. So folks are still checking in. We have over 50 people registered and we're about halfway there. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes. Not that what I have isn't interesting, but this will just allow everybody to get settled before we get started. So you're joining us to have a conversation about the supply chain, and in particular, what our marketing role is in helping to ease the pain for both ourselves and our customers and the folks in our supply chain. We're going to be having a collection of folks. I'm going to introduce each of them in a minute. So I'm just going to go to this next slide for a second and remind you again that ISBM has been around for a long time. Since 1982, when we were founded as a collection from academics and a few premier institutions that decided that we needed to do more research in advancing the science of B2B marketing and disseminating that to our member companies. The conversations we've been having around supply chain of late would tell us that since 1982, we haven't seen anything like this. So I'm glad we're here to be able to address it. Today, we have about 30 member firms that learn from each other and share information with each other, along with 29 academic distinguished research fellows and 18 B2B instructors and partners, several of whom that are on this presentation today. This is our ISBM leadership team, the one in the top left corner, that's me, Lynn. Rand is on the phone. Becky's going to be on the panel today. And then Stefan will join us a little bit later. He is the director of ISBM from Penn State. Lori makes everything run and does everything. Ralph is my immediate past predecessor, and Gary Lillian is Stefan's immediate past predecessor. And we are so grateful that we have this long-term brain trust with us to keep us running and smoothly. We have, as I said, a lot of fellows. Here's a little selection of fellows, and we have a few of them on our call today. So I'm really, really grateful, and especially was interested to see that Dr. Robert Speckman's with us today. We haven't talked in a while, and so I'm glad you could join us for this. And here's just a smattering of our ISBM member firms. Welcome to all of you. I'm glad to see you here, and I highly encourage you to ask specific questions that we might be able to help you with. We have assembled quite a group of folks that have knowledge and insights, and please don't hesitate to ask specific questions that might be able to help you. We're going to take questions in the chat window. Let me just talk a little bit about what's happening coming up. As we did last year, we're going to run the B2B Mastery Track series. That's an educational series that takes someone who might have come from, say, a technical background into marketing and through all of the marketing tools and education and thought processes that you might need to be a successful B2B marketer. You'll find that on our website. February 24th, we have a webinar coming up that if any of you are in this space of trying to get your customers to open your emails, you're going to want to hear this guy talk. He's got some amazing data and really some interesting insights. And so you might want to take a look at that or share that with your marketing communications people. And then March 15 to 21, we have another course, Unlocking the Pipeline Gridlock and Making Innovation and Portfolio Management Decisions. And I'll remind you again that everything we have is recorded, and you can find that at B2B Pulse, particularly if you're a member. We always get the question, will I be able to access this later? And the answer is yes. We hit the record button just as I started talking, and this 2 to 2.5 hours will be recorded and available on the isbm.com site for 30 days. And then after that, it'll be archived at B2B Pulse. So if you're in need of getting that for sharing with others, and you can't find a way to get there, just let us know, we'll help you. So here's how we're interacting today. If you look at the bar below in Zoom, you'll see that there is a section that is on the chat. Type the chat tab and type in your question. We are open mic for everything because we want to have a dialogue. So if you'd like to ask your question because it's complicated or just you don't want to type that much, then type that in the chat window and say you'd like to ask a question. Or you can physically raise your hand. I'll see it on your screen if you're on video, or use the raise hand icon and we'll call on you. So the way we're going to run this today is Dr. Brent Moritz is going to start us off, and he's going to give us a grounding in whatever the heck this looks like right at this moment. And so this is up to the date and an insightful look at where we stand. And when we scheduled this, I'll just have to say, when we scheduled this somewhere in mid-December, I was thinking we might be on the improving end by the time we did this a month later. But in fact, I guess he's going to tell us it's not that good. So you're going to listen to Brent. And then followed by that, we're going to have our 4 panelists, Joanne, Liam, Andrew, and Becky, each give us maybe a 10-minute or less synopsis of their perspective of where we are from their point of view. And I'm going to introduce each of them so you understand where their level of expertise is. Following that, we're opening it up to everybody. We've got some key questions we'd like to see the panelists address from their different perspectives, but we also just want to open it up to whatever you have as questions based on what we heard today. So we're live and running live. So let me just do some introductions. And first, I want to introduce Professor Brent Moritz. He is the Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management at the Pennsylvania State University Smeal College of Business. Brent earned his PhD from the Operations and Management Science Department of the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. He also holds a BS in Mechanical Engineering from Valparaiso and an MBA from the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western Reserve University. Prior to getting his PhD, Brent held positions in Operations and Supply Chain Management at Borg Warner, Eaton, and Parker Hannifin. This also included international experience working in Mexico, England, and Germany. Brent's expertise has been in high demand of late as he's being interviewed for major news channels, and we are really grateful to have him with us and as part of our family in the Smeal College. So welcome, Brent, and I'm so glad to have you today. We're really excited for this. Following Brent will be Joanne Smith. Joanne founded Price to Profits Consulting in 2013, and prior to that, she was the corporate head of marketing, pricing, and customer loyalty for DuPont. Joanne was one of the major reasons that DuPont's pricing went from weak to outstanding and delivered unparalleled profits. She is the author of several books. If you haven't read them, you'll want them. The Price Negotiation Playbook, the Pricing and Profit Playbook, and Pricing in a Crisis. And she's also in the faculty of the Professional Pricing Society, and she teaches for us ISBM as well. With more than 20 years of global business marketing, sales, and pricing expertise, she works with B2B and B2C companies around the globe, helping them develop world-class pricing and profit strategies, as well as training sales organizations. Probably more so though, that when you take a class from Joanne, you're going to learn courage and confidence and conviction in being able to take bold pricing actions and improve your profitabilities. So if you haven't taken a class from Joanne ever, you're going to want to take one. Liam is next up after that. Liam has an extensive academic background, too long to list, 30 years of practical experience in a variety of industries around the world, and he has corporate clients that are some of the best known brands. He's delivered executive education for more than 10 universities around the globe. Liam does custom designed intelligence and insight workshops. He does them also for us in ISBM, and he has enabled organizations to develop a deeper understanding of their emerging and potential competitive environments. Understanding that makes a real difference in thinking, decisions, and action. The difference is reflected in the development of new points of view about the future, new strategy options, new modes of strategy execution, and new organization-wide capabilities. Liam is going to remind us what we could have thought about before this happened, I'm sure. Liam also teaches a section of our B2B mastery track, which I mentioned earlier, and you'll want to take a look at that as well. Professor Andrew Petersen, who's not just yet with us, he's teaching a class just now, but join us shortly, is an associate professor of marketing at Penn State. He has a PhD in business administration with a concentration in marketing from the University of Connecticut and a BA in economics from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Go Tar Heels. Andrew's research interests include measuring and maximizing customer donor lifetime value, customer donor equity, customer product return behavior, and the value of word of mouth. With the current impact on the supply chain, we're really looking to Andrew to comment on our valuable customer relationships at this difficult time. And then rounding out our whole portfolio of great people that are going to talk to us today is Becky Williams. Becky has had a long and accomplished history before she retired from Lohr Corporation. For 38 years, Becky drove innovation and growth in engineering, business development, and operations. And most recently, she served as the president of the company's Asia Pacific region, and she resided in Hong Kong for several years. Under her leadership, APAC region achieved major new customer wins in a variety of businesses, including aerospace, automotive, and industrial. And prior to this, she served as the director of global business development and marketing and was the liaison from Lohr Corporation to ISBM. Becky holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering and a Master of Business Administration from Case Western. And we're really looking for her perspective too on what it looks like from other parts of the globe. So that's all of our team. And I am going to allow this now to go to Brent. Brent, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay. Let me share my screen here and get up my presentation. Okay. So thank you for that kind introduction. I'm looking forward to being with you here today. Just so you know, I'm going to spend about 30 minutes or so talking about some of the things with the current situation. The topic says supply chain managing the dilemma. I don't think dilemma is a strong enough word. Jamie Dimon said the word unprecedented is rarely used properly. And he famously said, in the case of this COVID-19 circumstance, it is completely unprecedented. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about what's going on in supply chain. Got a few trends and charts here that may kick us off with that some. Just so you know, I spent, as Lynn mentioned, about a decade in corporate America, really working mostly with B2B companies, Parker Hannifin, Eaton, and then Borg Warner. I spent a little time as I was doing my PhD with Medtronic on the medical device sector, doing some work with them. So it's been actually kind of fun now to go from, let's just say, relative obscurity of supply chain to suddenly it's front of mind, top of mind for everyone. And that's been fun. I've been interviewed on some of our NPR affiliates a few times. I've had a television interview. I got quoted in the Wall Street Journal actually last month, which is things that I've gone several years without that happening. And then suddenly a lot of it has happened recently, in part because we have this really unusual circumstance. So just to kick that off a little bit, here was a headline actually from September of this past year. Just get me a box inside the brutal realities of supply chain hell. From Bloomberg Businessweek. Super interesting headline and an interesting article to be sure. That chart is container ships at anchor in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach through actually September, October. If we actually looked at it right now, I actually haven't updated that chart, but we're looking at about 100 ships at anchor or offshore outside of the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Might be a little hard to see the graphic in here, but all these little dots you see here are container ships at anchor off the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So it's a huge challenge, particularly when you look at how much the total number of ships has gone up. They're actually parking the ships offshore more than 50 miles now so that they don't have quite as much air pollution right in the Southern California area. But they've got over 100 ships at anchor or waiting to be unloaded as of about a week ago. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about in introduction, supply chains and COVID-19, just a couple of things to level set what's going on. I'm going to break this up a little bit in terms of demand, some of the things that COVID has done to demand, both from a B2C as well as a B2B perspective. Then we're going to talk about supply, some on the transportation and distribution side. I'll have a few comments on the global nature and the complex nature of this, and then some time for comments, discussion, and questions, depending on the level of interest in this audience. So I'm happy to take some questions as we go along, and just engage that conversation. I'm pleased to be with you here with such a distinguished audience, and look forward to an engaging conversation over the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, so inside the brutal realities of supply chain hell, super interesting. But there was one other headline that I saw a little bit before that. Maybe some of you saw that. This was from Harvard Business Review from 2018, The Death of Supply Chain Management. Maybe some of you saw that. And they said, within 5 to 10 years, the supply chain function may be obsolete. And so here we are 3.5 years after that headline. And I'm asking some of you, is the supply chain function obsolete at your firm? Well, I doubt it. And I doubt that anyone would describe it as a smoothly running, self-regulating utility per the quote from this article. So it's been super interesting, as I mentioned. So the article talks about some of the reasons behind that. And in fact, two of the authors are, let's just say, consultants with a well-known consultancy that are talking about making investments in technology, those kinds of things. But I doubt that anyone is really seriously calling supply chains as obsolete anymore. One thing I did like about that article is it says they do need more supply chain analysts who can analyze data, structure, and evaluate data sets, use tools, and then recruit and retain more people with skills at the intersection of operations and technology. Well, guess what? That's what we do here at Penn State with our undergraduate program, is we try and have supply chain talent that is really at the intersection of operations and technology. And if you're interested, we actually have our spring supply chain career fair next week, and there's some more opportunities for that. Okay, so a little bit of background there. Another one that just was on CNBC here on Sunday, it says COVID zero policy could deal another blow to global supply chains. And here we are looking at China, and they've certainly followed that COVID zero approach of minimizing the spread of COVID and draconian lockdowns, those kinds of things. And there's more we could talk about with that, but that's probably the next shoe to drop, is when COVID starts to spread in China and the continuing disruption there. I don't want to get into that as much to say that that's probably where we're headed a little bit. And we can talk more about that. But here we are 2 years in. This is January 16th of 2022. We're almost 2 years in from the first cases. I don't think anyone in supply chain figured that this was going to be going on for 2 years. I certainly didn't. And so that's the other piece there. Okay, so getting back to what I mentioned with demand, I've got a few slides here that's going to talk about demand just a little bit. And here is from the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, the personal consumption expenditures in the United States. This is March of 2022, just when the first cases of COVID hit. We can see that there was a bit of a COVID dip, if you will, but particularly starting here in 2021, we've seen a pretty big increase in consumer spending in the United States. So demand has been up. And in particular, if you look at where it's been up, this is from the same data set. This is on furnishings and durable household equipment. Here again is the first case of COVID. We did see a bit of a dip, but what we've seen is, let's just say, a near parabolic rise in the consumption of goods in the United States. So people are spending far less money on experiences. People are not spending money on vacations. They're not spending money on sporting events as much, or movies, or going out to eat. They're spending a lot more on goods. So the idea that we would have a COVID recession, I think, was top of mind 2 years ago. What we've seen is really a remarkable increase. So people are spending money on things like computers, furniture, electronics, backyard pools, bicycles. Basically, it's been a shift from experience goods to physical goods. And so that's on the B2C side. If we look at it a little bit more, this is from the National Retail Federation. We haven't seen actually fourth quarter results, at least I haven't seen those yet, but they're talking about consumer spending being up 14.5% year on year. And in particular, we see big increases, 22.3% increases among the lowest income consumers compared to pre-pandemic levels. So these are pretty remarkable increases in demand that I don't think any supply chain was set up for. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview on the consumer side. What's going on the business side? This is non-defense capital goods. This is from the St. Louis Fed that I picked up actually about a week ago. So here's the COVID time. This is January of 2021 and into our COVID recession, if you will. This is on the B2B side. Considerable increase in spending on non-defense capital goods. That's on the B2B side, really going up quite a bit. And if you look at it from a historical perspective, these are some of the last sort of recessions we've had. This is the Great Recession here. This is after 9/11, kind of what's going on there. We're seeing a really big and steep increase in spending for capital goods as well, largely above historical norms, and an increase in demand far above what may be normal for some of those reasons. So that's a little bit of an overview on the demand side. We can ask ourselves a little bit of what's going on the supply side. I should pause to see if there's any questions first before I move to the supply side.
So we haven't had any questions posed in the chat window. Anybody can unmute if they want to ask a question or just type in the chat window.
Yeah, happy to take some questions if you need to.
Okay.
All right. So if we look a little bit on what's going on here, on the supply side, we've seen a really remarkable increase. These are TEUs. In supply chains, we talk about 20-foot equivalent units. Most of the containers now are 40-footers, but TEUs, the 20-foot equivalent units, is kind of the standard or one of the standards for presenting those. This is the historic number of TEUs or containers that are being imported into the US. This is what we've seen or were projected for 2021. You can see a pretty remarkable increase. So the supply chains have increased a lot. We've seen a lot more goods come into the United States. And this chart, I guess the teal colored ones, you can see how many more TEUs were coming in each month in 2021 versus 2020. Every month was much bigger. So when we talk about, hey, supply chains are constrained, we can't get enough, we're getting a lot more. It's still maybe not enough compared to what demand is going to be. So we've seen a really large increase in imports in particular, and that's continued all the way through. When you have that big of an increase, though, in shipping containers, of course, those of you, we've got some really big experts on pricing here. This one I thought was interesting. This is the shipping and container rates from Drewry.com out of the UK. So we can see that the composite increase as of last week, composite index was $9,500. That's this value right here. This is the average shipping container, their global composite shipping price for a container across the world. We were seeing, typical ranges from, let's say, $1,000 to $1,500 pre-pandemic. And then once the pandemic hit, it nearly doubled. We're talking $3,000 or $4,000 there. And in 2021, it's doubled again, or more than doubled again, to up to $9,400 here. And that's the average across all of those millions of containers that have been brought in. But it's not just, let's just say, Shanghai to Los Angeles or a US West Coast port thing. Look at the price from shipping from Rotterdam to New York is $6,800. That's an annual change of $187. We're also seeing, which I don't have a graphic for, backlogs in ports all across the US and all across the world. Felixstowe in the UK is the main shipping container port in the UK. They're backed up. Rotterdam has delays. Ports on the East Coast and in Texas have delays. So it's not just a West Coast thing. We're seeing huge increases with that. The other thing is, it's kind of interesting, is the Shanghai to Los Angeles route is about $10,520. Los Angeles to Shanghai is $1,200. So there's a big demand for getting stuff shipped from Asia into the US. The spot shipping rates, these are the averages, But the spot shipping rates are up even more than that. So we're talking, instead of $10,000 a container, the spot rates, particularly if you are a small importer and you want to get 1 or 2 containers from Asia, you're seeing the spot rates almost double that, particularly recently, $15,000, $20,000 a container. So you could have placed an order, let's say in August or September, agreed to pay, let's say $5,000 for that. And suddenly someone says, no, I want to pay $25,000. So the containers are getting turned away at the ports in, let's say, Shanghai and China because someone else is willing to pay a lot more for that. So the big importers, the Targets and the Walmarts and the Home Depots, they're seeing like their average rates go up. The spot people, the folks who are doing small scale imports have seen it go up a lot more. The other side to that is the shippers are making record profits right now, and they're really trying to put long-term contracts in place, but really had modest margins in the preceding decade. So that's a little bit of some of the backdrop there.
We have a question that came in. Can I ask that for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'll just read it to you. It seems the port congestion and the backups are caused by higher demand combined with what I assume is lack of labor due to COVID. Could the ports handle the volume in non-COVID times, or would they have needed to invest in infrastructure?
That's a complicated question. Let me come back to that in about 2 slides, okay?
Great.
And I'll give you some examples of what's going on there. The first is one of the reasons that we're seeing some of these increases here. I go back to September 19th, 2016. Does anyone know what happened on that day? My guess is probably not, but Hanjin Shipping had recently declared bankruptcy or receivership, being an international company. Hanjin was responsible for about 8% of the Trans-Pacific imports on a total basis. They had debt of $5.5 billion and had experienced operating losses of $226 million in the most recent quarter. They had large amounts of containers stuck in transit. They're talking about 400,000 containers in there, and they just weren't making money. The global shipping business was not especially profitable in the years, at least the decade preceding COVID. So back to James's question a little bit, there was not a huge increase in let's just say infrastructure. People weren't rushing to buy lots of new ships. They weren't rushing to put in lots of extra capacity in anywhere in the ports or the shipping industry, in part because people were making money in the main, but it wasn't especially lucrative. And no one was really anticipating that large growth in demand and imports that we've seen. Now, it takes about 2 years to get a new ship built from commission to actual launch. So on the shipping side, people are trying to get new ships. They're trying to add more capacity, but it certainly exceeded the capacity that was in place. So that's part of maybe the first part of James's question there. So the investments have been a little bit slowed. Second part to that gets to some of the sort of the driver delays and lack of labor. There's been a shortage of trucking for a long time. And the trucking industry is notorious for being a difficult industry. It's seeing a lot of driver churn, if you will. It's tough to get new people to want to become a truck driver for those. And some of the stats that you guys may have seen is things like, well, maybe 80,000 drivers short today and 160,000 by 2023. Now that's partially due to COVID. It's partially due to drivers retiring. Partially due to some of the restrictions that have gone on. For example, retired drivers that may still be eligible to go to the ports and pick stuff up. Suddenly under COVID restrictions, they decide, hey, it's just not worth it. Or I work part-time, I take a couple loads for a buddy of mine who has a trucking company. Yeah, I'm retired, I really don't need to do that. So that's put some strain on the port operations for sure. So it's not just a port issue. If you look at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach in particular, they've also put some restrictions on. There's a shortage of chassis and trucks that's been sort of exacerbated by some of the rules. For example, the California Air Resources Board has said that all drayage trucks, those are the ports that actually go on site at the ports, have to be converted to electric by the year, was it 2033? We're talking about 12 years, maybe it's 2035. I'd have to look at the numbers. But the lifespan of a truck is more than 20 years. So if you were looking at making investments a year ago or 2 years ago pre-COVID, you'd say, hey, I don't want to buy a new drayage truck right now when it won't be allowed on site in Los Angeles and Long Beach in 10 years when I have a 20-year lifespan. So people were not making huge investments on trucks. The other problem, and again, this goes back to James's question, which is really good, is we're seeing a huge shortage of warehouse space all the way through the supply chains. And we're seeing record low availabilities in vacancies in commercial real estate, particularly for distribution centers. And you're seeing that this is industrial real estate going, vacancy rate going down, particularly in the areas in, let's say, Los Angeles, say City of Industry, the Inland Empire area of California. You are seeing nearly no empty distribution centers for those. So all of those, or many of those containers that would get offloaded at Long Beach, you might have a shortage of drivers, you might have a shortage of chassis, and then they would normally get moved to, let's say, City of Industry. There's no place to unload those and put those out into our supply chains. So there's a lot of things that are happening there. There's a saying that half of the items that are imported into Los Angeles and Long Beach do not go east of Phoenix. They get distributed in the West Coast, which is obviously a major market there. But there's a shortage of space in our warehouses. There's a shortage of space in our trains, our intermodal piece. They do not have enough space in the rail yards all the way through, and there's a number of issues there. Looks like there's another question here.
Sure. Yeah, I'll read it out for you. If the port's empty, that is, if there were enough trucks to get the stuff out of there, would that reduce the cost to ship and reduce the prices paid for cargo shipping? And there's a second question. I've also heard rumors that California's restricted pollution laws are keeping truckers out of the state. Is it the truckers or the trucks?
I'll answer the second one first. Yes, it is both truckers and trucks. If you are a California-based drayage company, a trucking company, some of those are moving to Los Angeles because the California Air are moving from Los Angeles to, let's say, Nevada, so that they can be licensed in Nevada to get around some of those restrictions. But the California Air Resources Board has already limited the age of trucks that can operate in the ports, and they're doing that so that they would say that newer trucks would pollute less and be less detrimental to air pollution. So yes, California's restrictive pollution and age constrictions are keeping trucks out of state. There's also, it's actually difficult to actually get a license to go onto the ports because it's a national security issue. We don't want to let just anybody go onto those facilities. You actually have to have some work to get your license to be able to go on port. So that is taking some time, and it's been harder to get those licenses. Though I think some of that is changing. So that's been an issue. And then back to the first part of that question, if there were enough trucks to take stuff away, could that reduce cost to ship and reduce prices paid? Yes, but it's not as simple as just having more trucks. You need a place to put the things when you move them. And I guess part of what I'm saying is our supply chains are constrained all the way through. We don't have enough space in the ports. We don't have enough trucks and chassis and drivers. We don't have enough warehouses. We don't have enough trains and places to offload those, particularly when we've seen such a big increase in demand for goods that really was pretty unexpected. So hopefully that answers Robert's question.
And so just one follow on, this incredible increase for demand for goods, which might be driven by consumers not having anything else to do but to buy stuff. If in fact that is real and people are going to buy everything they need for a while, kind of in the period when they, all the trucks sold and there weren't any more trucks, will we see the opposite behind this? Or is this going the future forever?
Well, I think you will see potentially sort of a reverse bullwhip effect, particularly as the economy opens up and people start traveling again. And as people start going back and spending money on, let's say, vacations or going to Disney World or commercial airline travel, those kinds of things, that will abate somewhat. But we're seeing, so I don't expect demand to stay this elevated this long. But as to exactly when that's going to happen, I don't know for that. The other part to this is, and again, it's on this slide, is we've got shortages in many sectors that are impacting supply in some pretty unique ways. The first one of those, I think people have seen with the shortage of semiconductors and processors. That hits, think of how much we buy that has semiconductors and processors in it. Even the auto industry has been getting hit with the technology in cars these days. How many items have backup cameras and lane keeping assist and all manner of technology. Even the shift to electric cars. Electric cars take a lot more processors than sort of conventional internal combustion pieces. And we have a structural shortage of semiconductors all the way through. That is really hard to fix. And that's leading to some of the reasons we have shortages in cars and auto parts. Some of the other ones are maybe a little bit more expected. We have a shortage of semi trucks right now. If you want to buy a new semi, it's very, very difficult. And of course, you want to buy a new semi so that you can retain your drivers and give them in the best possible equipment, but there's not spare capacity of those. There's also shortages of really basic materials, aluminum, copper, nickel, aluminum cans, glass is in short supply. I mentioned on the list, there's lumber, building products, garage doors are in super short supply. So much so that people are getting waivers to get their occupancy permit in new houses. They're putting in temporary garage doors for those. The waiting list for garage doors is 5 months long. Now, some of that is due to supply constraints. Some of that's due to the Texas freeze that we had last February or so. Some of the chemical plants were shut down unexpectedly. It's a huge challenge. We've also seen shortages of natural gas, diesel exhaust fluid, polyethylene, base materials for plastics is in short supply. Zippers are in short supply. On the consumer side, takeout containers, because people are not going into restaurants, they're using a lot more takeout containers. So straws and lids and takeout containers have been short supply. And then you also see other climate-oriented disruptions. For example, French fries in Japan, some of that was related to some of the flooding in the western part of Canada, impacting the potato supply into Japan. So you've got shortages all the way through. To say nothing really about labor, if you will, and I've got a few more slides here which we can talk about. But one of them is, labor shortages are working all the way through the supply chain. So it's been hugely difficult. I'm sure many of our folks on this call have seen labor shortages in their respective organizations, all the way up and down from supply chains to manufacturing. that's a huge challenge. And I've got some points there. So Lynn, part of your question is, is consumer spending going to stay up the way it is? Probably not, but it's going to take a while for many of those issues to work their way through the supply chain. All right, I'm going on. Yep, go ahead, Joanne. Yep.
I'm going to try and pin you down here.
Yeah.
Can you give, I know one can't predict the future so much, but is there in your mind, it's going to be a bad, at least, let's say 3 months and could be the whole year? Could you give some projection?
Yeah, my crystal ball is a little bit cloudy, but there's two caveats. One is what happens with Omicron in China, and if they start going through big lockdowns, who knows what that's going to do. The second part is the unrest in, let's say, Russia and the Ukraine. Who knows what could happen in some of those black swan kinds of things. But I see some sectors changing. So for example, in the auto industry, we didn't destroy any production. We don't have any plants that burned down because of COVID. And we've got capacity in the auto industry, with the exception of computer chips. I think where we're at right now is in the auto industry, probably sometime around the end of the second quarter or into the third quarter of this year, you'll start to see a lot more cars becoming available, just because that's about the lag time it takes to get more capacity for things like computer chips in that industry in particular. So you'll see some of that start to change really in quarter 2 and into quarter 3. And that's going to change used car prices and do some other stuff there. In terms of some of the other items, some of them are structural shifts. It's hard to say, like point 3 here, we're going to see, the shift to online and omni-channel retailing. That's not going away anytime soon. If anything, COVID has accelerated that. So you will see a demand for distribution center space continuing to be strong for a long time, barring, like, again, some other black swan kind of event where people want to have their distribution centers located close to their customers. That's not going away. If anything, COVID has accelerated that. In terms of other availabilities, again, it's really hard to say. It depends on.
Well, Brent, I think I'm hearing you say we got probably at best 5 to 6 months on most things, and it could be far longer. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit more commodity or supply chain specific. My sense is the auto industry, and that's one that I think is probably one of our most well understood supply chains, and it's the one I know pretty well. I think end of Q2 into Q3, you'll start to see it turn around quite a bit for that. For some of the other items, it's going to be dependent on energy costs. Some of the issues we've had with plastics and fertilizer, polyethylene. Hey, no one wants to spend money when natural gas prices, particularly in Europe, are so expensive, and that's having some knock-on effects. Obviously, that's related to Ukraine and Nord Stream 2 and a whole bunch of things like that. So if we can get through this, these next few months and not have a war and not have things like not having disruptions in the energy supply in Europe, by Q3, Q4, we're going to have some of those things returning to more normal levels.
Thank you.
Put it that way. The other thing is that I don't expect to see the elevated shipping costs continuing. I expect them to go down quite a bit from where they are. I think this is really unprecedented cost to ship a container. That's not sustainable because there's just going to be more capacity that'll work through the system over time. And that's probably Q3, Q4, we'll start to see a big change in that.
Okay, great.
Yep. And we've covered some of these. There's just a few more things. I mentioned, workshop, live at home is driving changes. We're seeing that. We're seeing, as I said, we're moving from demand for experiences to goods. I think that'll switch when people are comfortable again doing more experiences. We're not going to be, let's just say, buying as many home electronics when we're out doing other things, and that'll switch. But again, this COVID zero policy, who knows what's going to happen there. We are seeing some other things, though, is we're seeing changes in supply chains. The whole digitalization, information sharing, that was a trend that was happening already. It's been accelerated. So there's been a lot more investments in that. And the firms that were making some of those investments are certainly managing the supply chain disruption a lot better. And then finally, the need for supply chain talent is still there. So it's great to see some of our students getting fabulous jobs with that. And I think everyone recognizes that continuing need for supply chain talent. Other questions?
That's great. Well, we know where to find you. You're going to be here for the next hour or so with us.
Sure.
So Gary Lillian says, isn't there any good news? What about never let a crisis go to waste? Gary, I'm going to table that one and let everybody go around that. And then we're going to come back and ask that of everybody, because, what do you do with this to make money is where we sit in the marketing side, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me call on Joanne, and she's going to want to share a couple of slides, if you wouldn't mind, Brent,
Sure. Yep.
reducing. And Joanne, go ahead and give us some thoughts about what you're thinking you would do if it was your business to run it today.
All right, let me see if I can screen share. It wasn't letting me while we were doing this. First, let me just say one, thanks, Lynn and Brent, fabulous. That absolutely sets this up for this dilemma, unprecedented times. And many, many companies are thinking, all right, as a result of this, should I be raising price? Most of the time they're saying, can I be raising price again or again and again in short periods of time? Or have I crossed that line and I need to hold so I have my long-term customers and relationships in a solid way? And so we're going to address that. And I have a little more than 5-10 minutes, so we're going to do kind of a speed dating version of what to do with price in this situation. So most of the time when I hear clients saying, maybe I should hold, it's because they know they have disappointed their customers. They have far longer lead times. They probably can't even get as much supply quantity that customers are asking for. And as I've already said, they may have already raised or raised multiple times and they're thinking, did I cross that line? Obviously, on the other side that says, yeah, but we still have rising cost. We're not getting ahead of them. They're just hitting us in our goods, in our parts, in our freight, in our labor. So there's a reason to want to raise as well. Now, there's one additional reason I'll put on the hold side, and I think this is really kind of an important thing for marketing people in specialty companies. So pay attention if this is one of you. A lot of marketing people in specialty companies attempt to value price or do it extremely well, which is absolutely best practice. But they say, I will not raise price when costs go up because I am so principle-based. I am all about value pricing. Well, I love the principle of value pricing, but some of you are not fully interpreting it in its best and appropriate way, because many of you should be raising. And let me give you kind of a quick example. If you have something special and you've premium priced it, and you probably have some other competitors that have similar, maybe not quite as good specialty products, and you've priced opposite them. But think about the fact that you guys in that industry of specialty also have a low-end competitor of some sort. Commodity, undifferentiated products, might even be doing it yourself. Those commodities and undifferentiated things that are just really a small knit of your competitor base are probably absolutely raising their price. They are raising it. And now you guys in the specialty zone, your value gap has just closed close to the commodity undifferentiated price if you don't hold. So your entire industry might have specialties may well need to raise for fair value price. So kind of think about it that way, and whether your own behaviors is actually depressing these specialties or whether you should be helping it. All right. With that aside, here's like the principle that I live on in pricing. You want the world to view you as fair and trustworthy, whatever your actions. And when I say the world, let's say the marketplace, I am talking about your own marketing and salespeople. I'm talking about your customers, customers, influencers, competitors should perceive what you do as fair and trustworthy. So let's take this kind of one step further, because by the way, when you do that, you're going to have long-term relationships. You're going to have much more success when and if you raise price. So there's 4 things that you need to have really aligned and working for you that would suggest, yep, you should be raising price 1, and 2, you will do it successfully without harming your long-term relationships. So let's look at market dynamics. By this, I mean you and your competitors, your industry, are there fair rationale for why you should raise price? I'm going to bet you, almost all of you, the answer is yes, because most all of you have increased cost of your parts or ingredients, increased freight, as Brent has already said, and many of you are all restricted in your capacity because you can't get materials to make things. So it's a tight supply. Absolute, that is likely favorable for all of you. Let's go to number 2 on my puzzle. Price volume trade-off. Now you're thinking, but if I raise again, maybe, will I start to lose share? Once again, I would tell you, likely, that's not the case. You're going to have more earnings raising price because price is 2 to 4 times more powerful at generating earnings than volume. In other words, you go up 10%, most of you could afford to lose 25 to 40% of your share and you will make more money. Well, there probably is no competitor that could take on 25 to 40% of your share because they're restricted. So the risk is low and price much more powerful in your favor. Let's go to number 3. Competitive dynamics. How are they going to act? Will they follow you up? Would be a good thing. Or will they drop price or hold price so that they can take your share either in the short term if they have capacity or long term? Well, here, if your competitors, like number 1, are under the same darn tight dynamics, they are more likely to act in similar ways, which mean they are likely to also want to stop this margin squeeze and raise price. And again, they probably don't have today's capacity to pick up your share anyway. But number 3, and this is very important, your competitors are more likely to follow up and be more disciplined if they believe you are a fair and trustworthy player. If they believe when you say you're going up, you're actually going up. You're not playing games to try and buy out their share. And that means, and that takes us to number 4, skills and behavior, right? We need the skills and behavior to make sure all parties feel you are doing something that is fair and trustworthy. You've picked a right amount of price increase and you've executed really well. Now here's the problem. 1, 2, and 3 are probably absolutely working for you. But number 4, I have surveyed thousands of sales people, sales leaders, marketing folks on how they self-rate their skills to execute and negotiate price increases. And these, let me just tell you, go from multi-billion-dollar businesses to $100 million client and very, very often experienced sales teams. And 90%, that's huge, 90% self-rate themselves at mediocre to weak in their skills here. Right? We got to get that skill in line if we want to do it successfully in a way that doesn't hurt us long-term. Now, good news, that is an easy thing to change with the right and proper 2-day training where we train and then we actually apply it, do the strategy and tactics for your next price increase. You can make like worlds of difference in that. All right, Lynn, there's my speed dating version of what
Great,
to do.
thank you. I expect we're going to come back around to you, so thank you so much. All right, so next up, we'd like to hear from our friend Liam. Liam, how about some words of wisdom?
Well, I won't necessarily call them words of wisdom, but I'm going to step back a little bit from Brent and especially from Joanne here for a moment. When I take a look at what's happening across companies, across industries, what hits me really hard is what I call the tyranny of economics 101. And by that I mean very simply, historically, we've looked at the world as if it was simply interrelated economies. But we've got to look at the world as if it's interrelated economies that are happening within a whole political world. And we forget about the political world, we end up doing all kinds of incredibly stupid things. And unfortunately, stupidity is not the preserve of Americans or Europeans or Chinese or Japanese. We all seem to have a great capacity to err on the side of doing truly stupid things, okay? Now, hopefully I've caught your attention, okay? Let me now come back and talk about connecting this into my world, which is the world of competitive and competitor analysis and doing scenarios. Let me just give you some very simple examples. I'm going to take you all the way back to 1995. Some of you may not be old enough to remember that, but Lynn and myself are. Sorry, Lynn, okay? Here's we're doing some very simple competitor analysis. And what do we end up doing? We create global value chains. That is, for 4 competitors, we identify their total global value chain, from raw materials to components, to shipping, to manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. And once we've got that global value chain identified, which is the easy part, we then step back and we ask some very simple questions. Number 1, where are the real vulnerabilities in this global supply/value chain of a competitor? Where could things really go wrong and what would the impact be? Okay. Second thing we look at is, where are the major cost elements in that value chain? What's going to drive those elements? Now, what we didn't look at in 1995, but you now have to look at in the world we're in today, is where are the connections across value chains? So if I'm now doing a value chain for General Motors in the auto industry, I'm going to find in the upfront part of that value chain, there's a little thing called semiconductors. I'm going to learn very quickly that semiconductors are not just bought by auto firms. They're all bought by every dog and its mother out there who needs a processor. And now I find myself competing with computers, who knows what, okay? So the connection that I now have across my value chain is I've got to look at industry convergence and industry integration that takes me way beyond my simple global value chain. I'll take you back to 1995 again. When we looked at one of our competitors, we happened to notice a little phenomenon. 80% of this competitor's output for its Asian market, broadly defined, was coming from a production facility outside a little city named Osaka. Anybody see where I'm going? What might be the vulnerability to a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Osaka that's accounting for 80% of your throughput for all your Asian customers? I can almost smell brains turning over here. Let's now think about a phenomenon called earthquakes. Now, earthquakes usually don't show up in any global value chain that I've ever looked at. But when you start thinking about vulnerabilities, you start asking the question, what might happen to that manufacturing facility that might put it out of business? Now, other than asking some of my friends to go over there and take it out of business, which I don't recommend, natural disasters. Well, guess what? About 6 months after we did this analysis, there was indeed an earthquake in Osaka, and it destroyed this plant. Marketing implication? Because we had done the global value chain analysis, our US headquartered firm had all of its marketing and salespeople on flights the following morning to every major customer across Asia that was being supplied by this firm. And we literally were in the customer's operations, selling to them before the Japanese firm realized what was happening. And we ended up taking about 75% of their Asian sales within about 1 month flat. Now, this is not a generic marketing theory that I'm espousing here for marketers, but it is an emphasis upon understanding where your global supply chain is, who's involved in it, what's involved in it, what the impacts are, what the vulnerabilities might be, and what the opportunities might be. Okay? Second thing that I want to talk about here on global supply chains is being very clear on going from raw materials all the way through your end customer's customer, all the way out to consumers. A lot of B2B firms have a very short perspective on value chains and global supply chains. Okay? Need to broaden that perspective all the way up to the very beginning, all the way out to the end consumer. One that we're involved in right now is looking at precious metals and earth metals, most of which are in China. And now you think about the political context of China and what might happen to those and how that might affect all kinds of industries and all kinds of value chains that we typically don't think about, yet the opportunity and the vulnerability is very real. Okay? Let me now skip to the second thing that I want to emphasize here. And this goes back to some things that Joanne talked about and implicit in what Brent talked about. To me, everything that Joanne talked about in pricing and a lot of what Brent talked about in global supply chain issues presumes the ability to develop very simple future-oriented scenarios in the form of what-if questions. Our scenario deals two things. It asks, what if the world were such and such? The second part is, what would we do? Okay? So a number of B2B firms that I'm aware of right now are beginning to do some fairly serious scenario work at a global end, at an Asian end, at an American end, North American end, and at a European end by asking, what if supply constraints get more severe? Okay? Politics enters in particular ways, pricing moves in a particular direction, supply constraints affect different parts of our chain. If that world were to emerge, what would we do? Both from a manufacturing end, from a supply chain end, from a product development end, from an R&D end, from a pricing end, etc. So the two parts here are very critical, asking the what if question, and then asking what the implications are. The power of doing those simple scenarios is that they provide key access and quickly into the prevailing assumptions that are underpinning your current strategy or that should underpin your current strategy. So now you compare the existing assumptions. And of course, I'm presuming here that you've carefully identified your assumptions, which most often is not the case. That's a whole other conversation. But if you begin to think about what kinds of assumptions are you making, and then you challenge those assumptions against your knowledge of supply chains and everything else that gets involved with them, you can end up with a much more refined set of assumptions And the value of that is very simple. You then continue to monitor change across the value chain, across the supply chain in the political economies to identify which assumptions are holding or not holding and modify them over time. So the supply chain conversation gives you another access point into developing fairly simple but powerful sets of scenarios that tie directly back into your key marketing decisions and all other kinds of decisions in the organization. So the 2 points that I wanted to make here very simply was the power of developing very detailed global supply chains as part of your competitor analysis, and then spinning out of that into developing simple but powerful scenarios to indicate what might happen and what do we do were it to happen. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any comments from at this point before we move on to our next speaker? I'm still holding the question about how do we make money on this, Gary, so don't worry about that. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Andrew Petersen. Andrew's finished teaching his class and has joined us. And so Andrew, if you would take the floor and give us some thoughts from your perspective around our customers. Thanks, Liam.
So first, I'll apologize, Brent. I missed what you had to say. I did get your slides, so I just missed the context of you saying them. As Lynn said, for the last 4 hours, I've been teaching our marketing core to our early career MBAs and our first year MBAs here. So I'll talk, I think, maybe a topic that's more relevant to me since I just finished teaching analytics to our students, is specifically around the use of that in a marketing context for customer management. So I just want to bring up 2 quick trends that I've seen a lot. And so going into pandemic times, 2 things were happening. One, I think a lot more firms were trying to become more analytically driven in a lot what they were doing. You heard all these fancy terms like AI and machine learning and this and that, and it's still in its infancy. But a lot more firms were turning to data as one avenue to help them make better decisions. The other was the move to becoming more digitalized. I think through the pandemic, especially, a lot more firms had to adopt a more digital-based strategy, which pretty heavily leverages the ability to collect and manage data for making customer decisions like Salesforce targeting decisions, digital marketing decisions, all these types of things. And I just want to sort of bring up what I've noticed dealing with firms in this space and then kind of leave it from there. So I'll try and be pretty brief. One, I've noticed that, so we generally think of 3 types of analytics. One being what I would call descriptive analytics, which is telling me what happened. 2 being prescriptive analytics, which is trying to explain why something happened. And 3 being predictive analytics, which is trying to forecast or predict what will happen. The latter 2 were becoming really popular and useful ways of doing analytics, but rely heavily on the fact that you have data that actually can tell you how and can predict. And right now, we don't have that data unless we want to look back a number of years. So more and more firms are dropping the prescriptive and predictive analytics and really getting back into the simple, what's going on here and what do I see happening at this moment? So I think descriptive analytics are becoming more powerful than they've been in a while. The second is the type of data. I think a lot of firms were sort of building up these internal databases of like customer transaction information to predict who's going to buy what and when and all those sorts of things. And sales targeting information and all that kind of stuff. More and more, I think we need to leverage external data, and I would say primary data collection. I think no time in the last, since before my time, Liam, I was alive in 1995, but I was not doing market research at that point in time, as you talked about. But I think more since even before my time has market research been a useful tool gathering new data than database marketing, looking at our own data, because our own data is terrible at predicting right now. but currently going out and talking to customers, so think voice of the customer, think doing primary data collection is, I think, more useful than it's been in years, because it's actually giving us insights that are relevant now, rather than trying to take the last 5-10 years of data and predict what happens. And the other thing that's coming in is more and more people I talk to think that they are disease experts because they have to be to make good models. I don't think that's the case. I think having external data, building risk models, I think Liam made a really great point about knowing scenarios, right? What if the pandemic takes another turn? What happens versus what if it doesn't, right? Those would be good scenario plans that are easier to think about than trying to go out and gather, disease spreading data and try to do all sorts of predictions around that. I think it's important to have risk built into your models, but I think it's probably best to go out and do some market research and plan for some different scenarios and try and simplify what you're doing in your approach, then wait for the data to sort of be cleaned out after some time before going back to more prescriptive and predictive types of things. So I think my final message is we have so much new data, so much stuff we can do, so much better we can do our sales targeting, our digital marketing, our customer management, but we have to hit a little bit of a reset. The data is still very powerful, but I think we need to go back to some of our basics. And if we utilize that, I think, I'm seeing a lot of success at understanding and managing through the pandemic. And my last example, since I talked about Liam, I'll talk about Joanne's example around pricing, which I thought was great, which is if you want to know your customer's willingness to pay, go do primary research right now and talk to them, maybe run a conjoint analysis with them, maybe do some simple pricing tests, realize that they are willing to pay more because they value your relationship and have the courage to sort of manage the price execution side of it. I think now more than ever that willingness is there. And you also find that even if you lose some customers, your core constituency of customers with a higher willingness to pay will be more profitable. So analytics is power. We just have to rethink how we're doing it to make better marketing decisions. So that's what my message is.
Great. All right. And I'm going to ask Becky if she will kind of give us her perspective from all the years of living in the space that all of you are today, plus being our representative from us to who have been having managed businesses from outside of the US. So Becky, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, and lots of great comments and lots of things for me to think about from an executive running a business perspective, all the input from these experts. I'll start with a little bit more about my background. So I came up through the organization in a not too uncommon path of starting as a product design engineer and then moving into program and project management, sales and marketing, systems improvement, and then business leadership and regional business leadership. So through that journey, seeing lots of pieces of the organization. And one of our customers, so in Lohr Corporation, where we made products for the automotive industry and the aerospace industry. One of our customers who build helicopters would remind us when we would call to ask for a change in a product schedule or to unfortunately communicate a late delivery. They would say, "Do you know how many parts it takes to build a helicopter?" All of them. Which to me really emphasizes the complexity of supply chain and the importance of every little piece and how easily it is disrupted. Because yeah, you really can't build a helicopter with most of the parts. You really need all of the parts. So it helped frame for us the importance of maintaining close communication with customers, which I'll jump ahead a little bit. I think that's one answers to Gary's question about the opportunity right now to have closer communications with customers, as Andrew also suggested. Our customers are just as confused as we are about what's going on here and when it's going to end and what they should do about it. So it gives all of us as suppliers to them the chance for a new and different kind of dialogue and to get closer to them and work with them through this. But getting back to how I thought about supply chain as an executive and kind of overlapping it with a framework from project management, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, in good, fast, and cheap. And so we would all set up how we are managing our supply chain. Maybe we were mostly focused on good, which means we wanted to control everything. We had really tight specs. We had few suppliers who could meet those specs, and it was a long process to do that. Many sole source suppliers. Or maybe we were focused on fast, and we had suppliers who would hold a lot of inventory up for us, or we would hold inventory ourselves, or we would keep multiple suppliers qualified on each product so that we could always get what we wanted quickly. Or we would be focused on cheap, and we would have lots of suppliers in competition with each other to always get the lowest price. Or we would buy subsystems, so we would push a lot of the complexity down to our suppliers and who were more experts at managing those things, and could deliver us cheap subsystems that we could, which also maybe went with fast. Once you get something like that running, it can then lead you to believe that, yeah, we got this nicely oiled machine going, our supply chain's going well. Back to Brent's original quote from pre-pandemic about how, hey, in the future, we're not even going to need a supply chain organization, because look, we got all these processes in place and everything's running, and we're going to computerize it all, automate it all, and this is all going to go away, which then links into what Liam says is the way all those systems work well are based on a lot of assumptions. And as leaders, if we are not aware of underlying assumptions, and if we are not occasionally checking back to see, are those underlying assumptions still true, we get nailed. And that's so whatever supply chain setup we had, whether we were focused on good, fast, or cheap, the pandemic has changed some of those underlying assumptions, if not a bunch of them. And the longer it takes us to be aware of what those assumptions even are, how they've changed, how they're going to continue to change, it just makes us more and more vulnerable and confused going forward. Like, how did this happen to us? What do you mean the computer system I set up, the analytics I set up, are the data they're collecting from the past to project the future is no longer working? It's because we've lost sight of underlying assumptions. And in B2B, the good news, bad news about underlying assumptions is some of our underlying assumptions have been true for a very long time, such that we really do take them as fact. We don't even recognize them as assumptions, and so we don't recheck them very often. That gives us, that's a good thing for us in that our business models can sometimes work for a really long time. Some of our value propositions stay relevant for a really long time. As I said, the downside is we can lose sight of what those assumptions even are, so we aren't ready to do something about them when they change. So I think this has been, really great input from everybody. I love Joanne's points about recognizing what's going on around us to know when we can raise price. A lot of that's based on underlying assumptions, right, of what our customers do and don't care about, and where they can and can't tolerate a price increase. Creates another great opportunity to get close to the customer again, to talk to them about that. So I think those are, in a short few sentences, where I'm thinking as how I thought as an executive about these things, and what I would be doing now, and what the executives that so right now I do executive coaching, what the executives I'm talking to now are thinking about is kind of what do we know to be true now? Adaptability is huge. How am I going to stay adaptable and use that primary data to figure out what do I need to do going forward from quarter to quarter, because I can't see ahead to when this is going to completely settle down.
Thanks, Becky. I really appreciate it. So we've got some questions that are coming in, and I've got some ones that are queued up. And I think, there was one that was brought up earlier, which is, Gary Lillian would like us to just cut to the chase. How are we going to make a good thing out of this bad thing that we have? And I don't want to take away from Joanne, but she's talked to us a bit about price increases, but I was thinking a lot about the allocations and some other behaviors. So let me just, maybe I can just go around the group again. If you want to be first, just raise your hand to me. I've got you all pinned so I can see the speakers. Who wants to take the question of, so how do we make something out of it? Okay, Joanne would like to tell you how you make money on this. Go ahead. All right.
So clearly it's an opportunity to get some price. And as we get some price, it's an opportunity to really look back at what have you done the last 3 to 5 years and what your margin's been doing. So you might get just a little more than today's things if you have not been managing well. However, or in addition, let me just say, if you have favorable dynamics, as I do believe you do, then you can also be changing policies and practices. Some of those things that you or your industry have done for years that really have seen its day, time to change that. And then right on what Lynn would say is from marketing folks, this is a phenomenal time to either do or redo your differential management. Look at your customer needs-based segmentation and take that constrained capacity that you have, those different policies that you should be changing, and begin to really do that kind of differential management to advance yourself. You got the window of time to do things you couldn't have done.
Never waste a good crisis. Who else wants to jump in on things we ought to do now? Go ahead, Andrew.
So now I'll say my customer thing more and say, now is the time to, instead of being product centric and build better products and services, to go and figure out who your best customers are, decide what they need, serve those customers, innovate for those customers, and then worry about the rest that comes down the chain. So now is the time to identify who your strongest relationships are from your most profitable customers, and serve them and innovate for them and set policy around them in hopes that you'll find other people that look like them as potential customers.
Good. All right. Liam, Brent?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that is getting elevated is supply chains on top of mind for everybody. It's been fun when I see someone and they say, what do you do? I say, well, I'm a professor of supply chain. Well, let me tell you about X. And someone tells me, someone gives their own story. I think some of that's happening in a lot of corporations where they realize the importance of supply chains. For a long time, the knock on supply chain management is it's all about cost reduction. Well, guess what? This is not all about cost reduction. This is, there's so much more that's going on here in terms of value. And I think folks outside of supply chains would be surprised how much the supply chain function talks about bringing value to the customer. Now, we're not talking about marketing, let's say, or trying to necessarily shape that, but supply chains spend a lot of time thinking about defining value from the customer's perspective. And I think, the long-term piece to this is, for the next 30 years, people are going to say, what happens if there's another COVID? And turn to their vice president of supply chain and say, well, what are we doing to make sure we're well positioned to respond when the next crisis comes? So that's maybe one piece of elevating that and elevating the conversation about how do we make the right investments long-term in ways that are going to help us build more resilient supply chains.
Liam, you want some words on that one?
Let me just pick up on what Brent said, because COVID is just one example of an outside force that should cause an executive team to go back and review the totality of their business. It's as simple as that. Because if you've set up how to do business and you've been very successful for 10 or 15 or 20 years, it's the COVID impact that will tell you very quickly why that will not succeed in the future, what you have to do to readjust the business. And so whether you're talking about supply chains or talking about marketing or talking about investment, where you want to spend your financial resource, et cetera, all of these come together. And that's another way of saying, and I've said this quite emphatically, supply chain management is too important to be left to the supply chain managers. And that is true of marketing, that is true of finance, that is true of operations, et cetera. We slowly come to understand that we need to have an integrated perspective on how we manage the business. And that to me is the one major thing that has come out of COVID. When I work with senior executive teams, they no longer want to leave these kinds of decisions to their CFO and the finance group. You know, it certainly they'll screw it up in terms of long-term consequences. And you need to talk quite bluntly like that inside organizations to get people's attention.
So how do
I
you
can
broker?
do it.
Yeah,
I
I think that's a great point, Liam, that, you know, we often don't get a seat at the table for some of these conversations in marketing. Do we have some examples or ways to kind of get those doors to open, or are they opening now because when in a good crisis, they'll go looking for help everywhere? Anybody?
I mean, I have a very simplistic and maybe naive view on getting a seat at the table. You get a seat at the table when you deserve it. So if marketers are coming forward and they're making proposals and they're showing how those proposals affect cash flow in and out, and they're able to talk with the finance people in shareholder value terms and cash flow terms, then they'll get heard.
Good. Brent, we had a question about whether companies in the B2B space did what the consumers did in the early parts of the pandemic, which is to kind of hoard those things like toilet paper. Do you think that some of this is artificial demand?
Well, it's hard to say all companies, but I know in the automotive space, they took a lot of production out of their production schedule really early on in the space. They said, oh, customers, we're preparing for a COVID recession. Demand for autos is going to go down. So they pulled production out of their schedule, canceled orders with the semiconductor companies. And guess what? At the same time, that capacity was getting used by all manner of other consumer electronics and all other things that use those chips. So some of the reason the automotive business was constrained is they took it out of their schedule themselves, and it wasn't so easy to put it back into the schedule. So some of that is certainly self-inflicted. To the extent that that happens elsewhere, hoarding, I don't think so. I don't think there's a lot of hoarding going on in our B2B supply chains going on. People are trying to get whatever they can all the way through. There could be a little bit of that in certain industries where people say, hey, look, I know I'm going to be, let's say in the trades piece, construction, for example, construction materials have been in short supply. So people have been buying some of those up in anticipation of what they're going to need, but they're only a few months ahead potentially on some of those. So I don't think that's as big a factor as it could be for some of the places like automotive.
And what we also saw in the consumer space is that people, well, the production of toilet paper, just as an example, was really having to be changed because consumer toilet paper wasn't the same as industrial sized grades, right, or values. So is that happening now in the supply chain? Are people changing over how they deliver it, and either packaging it or in other ways?
Well, just to talk about toilet paper a little bit, it's a popular example. Think about how much toilet paper was used or consumed in workplaces, hotels, airports, restaurants, all those things. And suddenly everybody has to buy that toilet paper on a consumer basis. You know, you're not buying cases of toilet paper. So the interesting thing is the underlying consumption of toilet paper has not changed. And the manufacturing of toilet paper has not changed. What has changed is how consumers were buying the stuff is dramatically changed. Now, we didn't have some big warehouse of toilet paper around for those kinds of things, but certainly people, you know, were buying a lot more toilet paper at the store because they used to use some of it at their workplace, or they used to get a big roll of it and then use it at Penn State or some other institution, and some of that was used that way. You know, to the extent our companies doing the same thing, well, there's probably some of those shifts going on, but it's really hard to say, and it's really probably industry specific. I don't know that I want to comment too much further than that.
Okay, so we have a specific question, which is, you know, for you to look in your foggy crystal ball. When do you think the cost of the container transport will level off just level off? Because obviously it just keeps going up and up and up.
Well, we're already seeing that the weekly rates are declining just a little bit from, let's just say, December. They've started to come down just a little bit. They will probably trend down in 2022 over time. Now, as I mentioned briefly, some of those steamship lines were trying to leverage long-term contracts at elevated rates in order for companies to get extra shipments of containers in a timely basis. So they were trying to use their structural power, if you will, to leverage that into long-term contracts. And firms were naturally quite resistant to that over time. I expect that it will come down through in 2022 and into 2023. It's going to get down to where it's more reasonable. This $10,000 or this $20,000 spot rate for a container is way beyond what the actual costs are to move a container from Shanghai to Los Angeles. And those kinds of things don't tend to last in the long run for something that is, let's just say, more of a commodity kinds of things. Even people like Amazon have figured this out. They're chartering their own ships. They're putting they're chartering their own ships with 53-foot containers on them and putting them on bulk cargo carriers and bringing them into some non-containerized ports for this. That, those kinds of competition will change that dynamic. So I'm expecting by mid-2022 that the rates to come down to, let's just say, more reasonable levels is what I would expect.
And for anybody that wants to answer this, have we seen any companies now looking at that space that they have, the land that they may use that no longer has people sitting in offices, being repurposed for anything that looks like more inventory onshore, so that they can just have less inventory in transit and more that's local and ready to be used? Kind of a dismantling of just in time. Okay, so I got a shake of the head that no, I don't think we've seen that. Brent, you haven't seen that. I haven't heard it, but I'm listening to Liam talk about scenarios and how do we prepare for the next one? You would think that you might want to at least hold some more inventory of certain things. I don't know what those are, closer to home, but nope, we haven't seen any movement, huh?
Well, we're seeing it in places where we used to have big retail spaces. We are seeing like some of the big box stores and some of the old, let's just say, dead or dying malls get repurposed to being distribution centers. And that kind of thing is likely to happen in the future because we're buying more stuff online. So let's just say the 1980s mall building boom is going in the opposite direction as we move to online and omni-channel retailing. That trend was happening already pre-COVID. COVID just accelerated that trend to online shopping by 5 years or so. And then necessarily people are saying, well, what do we do with all this empty mall space? It's got lots of parking lots and these big box shell stores. So some of those are getting repurposed to distribution and warehousing.
Great. All right, I'm going to reach out to the audience again and just see if there's some more questions that they want to bring to us. And I'm going to open up my view so I can see everybody. If you've got a question and you like to answer directly, just throw your video on or take yourself off mute. And I'm trying to see everybody at the same time, which is just a wonderful challenge on Zoom. All right.
It's like there was something put in the chat. I was going to type a long response, but I don't know if you want me to answer it.
No, go ahead and answer it. That's the beat, sure.
So yeah, Beat raised the question of dynamic system thinking. Essentially, I think if I read this correctly from my knowledge, it's the idea that you can sort of machine learn your way around data to look for trends and things that are happening. And part of the issue with that right now is that it's garbage in, garbage out, right? If I have predictive models that were predictive when markets were stable and now they're not, it becomes more challenging to rely on data that way. Now, in your second part of the comment about ecosystems, I think what's interesting is that so many more ecosystems are happening, sort of integrations of firms, which leads to integrations of data across firms that is useful for doing this. That data is so much more valuable now, especially if you bring in some external data, market data, something macro level data, and feed it into that system, because I think you'll learn faster from ecosystem data and sort of be able to reset your assumptions and look for some new trends. So I think shorten your data history and expand your cross-section to more firms, more data types, you'll get more out of it. If you take a more time series approach and say, what have the last 15 years taught us about what we should do next, you're going to probably hit a wall. So that would be my recommendation to that comment about ecosystems. I know that I see Stefan turning his, he's also an ecosystems person, so I think he probably has something good to say as well.
Great.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for all your contributions. I thought it's incredibly interesting. I had a comment indeed also to Beat's question. There is a natural link, I think, between supply chain management and marketing. And you see this in like the operations management domain. We actually really talk about similar topics sometimes. In marketing, that was my take on the question. Maybe it's a bit of a different take compared to Andrew's, but in marketing, long have we kind of heralded the building very strong trust-based relationships with suppliers, right? And over the years, it has become clear that these obviously have advantages like trust and so less conflict and so on. But on the other hand, it also reduces your agility, right? It makes you less flexible. It kind of locks you in with certain suppliers. It's in that sense actually that I actually interpreted Beat's question. Like we've just completed a study last year where we do advocate more of a systems perspective to look at the supply chain. What we basically examined was the modularity of such systems. We know system modularity from new product development, right? You develop a business solution that consists of several components. A system is more modular if the interfaces between these components are a bit more standardized, if it's easier to switch one component for another. Many firms have used such an approach to develop new products in a high variety of new products, but based on a similar platform. What we basically found is that if you think of your supply chain in that sense, then you can actually come up with more of a modular supply chain system where you can work and switch suppliers more easily, thanks to more standardized interfaces. That will keep suppliers on their toes, which kind of delivers you the same benefits as a trust relationship, right? But it can also keep you agile. It makes it easier to respond to change. And so in that sense, I think that it is interesting to think of supply upstream, but also connections with buyers downstream in this broader marketing ecosystems kind of logic indeed. And to think of that as a system and to treat it as a system and to think of new ways that deliver both the benefits of good collaborative forms, but also the flexibility to actually change. And that's why these long-term trust relationships with suppliers don't really give. They give you the trust advantages, but the disadvantage of inflexibility. I don't know, Brent, if you recognize any of that from your supply chain perspective as well.
Sure, absolutely. We talk about some of those same themes as we think about supply chain design. Certainly modularity, those kinds of things, and then being strategic about how you align those, set up your supply chain, the different kinds of relationship with different kinds of suppliers for various reasons. That's a longer discussion for sure, but I certainly understand where you're headed with that. Looks like Joanne has her hand up.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in a little bit on this discussion and what Liam said, which is around integrated business teams. And if I go back to my DuPont days, I was actually, we had a business integration team to get away from the silos that so often cause us to suboptimize our entire businesses. And one of the things that I particularly headed was a commercial optimization strategy that literally looked at marketing and sales policies that aligned with supply chain capabilities. And when we were able to make changes without a single dollar in assets, just modifying our sales and marketing policies to align with that relative to different customer needs, our best customers and worst, we did things like freed up 20 to 40% capacity just by changing supply policies or sales policies, higher prices, better on-time deliveries to our best customers. So I'm just going to reiterate really what many of you have said. When we bring the power together and not work in our functional silos, boy, do we open up some possibilities. That's it.
We had a note from Brian. I'll just read this out and then I'll let you see who wants to take it. There's a famous statement that generals are always fighting the last war. So is this the situation we're in now where we're trying to fix our things based on what we know from the past? Will the next crisis or disruption look different from this one? So can we actually learn from this? Or do we still need to be looking ahead for something that's going to look different from this itself?
One of those famous generals also said that hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, right.
So there's a direct connection here. And this is where I go back to sort of simplified scenarios in terms of what the world might look like. And I'm talking here very simplified views of what if kinds of questions to make sure we do not fall into the trap of simply hoping for the past to repeat itself and hoping for our capability to deal with anything that pops up in the future. And so there's a connection in the scenario world between a view of what the future might look like. So when you map that out around an ecosystem, for example, which we've done several times, what might the ecosystem look like, 5 years out? Who are going to be the participants? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the players? What kinds of alliances might you look like? What kinds of products are going through the system? What does rivalry look like at different parts of that ecosystem? And then you play that back to ask a very simple question. If we found ourselves in that ecosystem 5 years out, where are the business opportunities for our business? Now, some of the business opportunities may be in terms of how you manage the upfront part of the supply chain or the back end part of the supply chain, or the kinds of alliances you create at the next generation of R&D, where it all goes back to the point that Joanne just mentioned of forcing ourselves to take a really different look at what the world might be 3, 4, 5 years out, and how our firm might be different working in that world. And that takes a lot of moxie on the part of a small number of people to really push that through the organization, get the right kinds of people involved. And most of all, do not leave that to the marketing people alone to think it through, or the supply chain management people, or God save us from all disruption, the finance people to think it through. It's a combination of all of those people need to come together, augmented by some outside people who don't have the vestiges and the legacy effects that you gain from being living inside the organization.
Hey, Liam, I just jump on that. Absolutely critical. When I am working with companies with advanced pricing strategies, we are taking scenarios. We are looking to try and predict what's out there, because sometimes we can change it so we have more pricing power. And even if we can't change it, we can get ahead of it. So we change how we do contracts or other parts of our business to take advantage. So I am like a big proponent in getting some of those strategies. And Brent, it goes back to me pushing you a little bit. How long is this going to last? What's the best? What's the last? Because if you're thinking about pricing, I would say you get that pricing out in the next 5 to 6 months when Brent thinks it's probably still some really favorable things. If you wait to the end of the year, depending on your sector, you might not have as much power. You might.
Just to follow up on Joanne's question a little bit, that's one of the unique things about this COVID-19 piece is, usually when we're talking about disruptions, we're talking about them being sort of localized or regionalized. So if there's a hurricane on the Gulf Coast, for example, that's sort of a well-known sort of risk to the petrochemical industry. Or if there's an earthquake in Japan or an earthquake in the West Coast, those are things people have thought about. At least the best companies have said, what if there's an earthquake that hits the San Andreas Fault? What does that do to our supply chains? The best companies have asked that question. What is really unique about, or one of the things that's unique about COVID-19 is that this is a global issue. And again, back to Jamie Dimon, it's so unprecedented to have this level of disruption hitting the entire world at the same time. If we think about it in terms of like a storm or something, if there's a bad storm in the Gulf Coast, the electrical suppliers send all their trucks to the Gulf Coast and get the electrical supplies back up and running in a few days or weeks, those kinds of things. You don't have that option when you're dealing with a global issue like COVID-19. And so there isn't that level of experience with it. I mean, the best example we've got is like the 1918 Spanish flu. But that's 100 years ago is like the best disruption, or maybe World War II, something like that. But no one has that experience with this. And Liam, you're spot on about developing some of those powerful models, but I don't think anybody was anticipating, how do you build a model for a global disruption that now has lasted 2 years? No one was asking that, or at least putting a lot of stock into those things. That's really has been unique about COVID-19.
Hey, Lynn, if this would be all right, we've asked the audience if they had any questions, but I'm wondering if there's anybody on the line that has some learning that we could all learn from as well, and if they would be willing to share.
Sure, we'll put that question out to the audience, and folks can just turn on their mic and or video. If you put your video on, we'll know you want to talk, because everybody else that's not talking is gone to pictures for me. So I'll leave that out there. Meanwhile, while they're thinking about whether they're ready to do that, there's a question that came in, which is interesting because we think about this a lot on the marketing side, but comments were made about focusing on your best customers at this time. So that would suggest that things like account-based marketing is going to gain momentum as a methodology. What are your thoughts on that, folks?
But, from a pricing perspective, it goes back to differential management. So we have some of our best customers, some of our less best, some will take more risk on. So I just say we want a strategy for all, but the best, we want to do everything to really lock those down. And I don't always think of the best as the biggest. I think about what are those that buy enough and that actually really align with what my company is good at, right? That are going to be loyal to me because we have such an alignment. And how do I keep that really good thing going? And then I think about, from the other side, a lot of those customers that are big, and we'd love to have them, but we know what we're disadvantaged. We are not their go-to. And what can we do so that as we come out of this and marketings are softer, what can we do to turn some of those around to stay with us and or to grow with us? And of course, some of the smaller other ones, we're more about walking away at this time, raising their price, risking it so that we better serve those that will be with us in the long term.
Anyone else? All right, so we can thank Jerry for this one so we can go down this path. Jerry says, is there anything that government should or shouldn't be doing now, in your opinion? Okay, I'm stepping back, go. Wow. Hey, Liam, come on, I know you better.
Wait, I'm not going to talk about politics. Who was it, Liam? You're the one that says politics are in here. Take it.
Yeah. Why don't we go out and get a presentation from some of the folks who are involved in national security on what they see as potential threats to the global environment? It will knock our socks off. And if you think that COVID was an interrupter, think about some of the things that they're paying attention to. Impact on global food supply, computer viruses. I'll stop there. I won't give too much away.
It's scenario planning at a level higher. Yeah.
Contingency planning.
They've got the details worked out,
Mhm.
and it could happen very, very quickly.
Disruption in Taiwan right now to the global semiconductor business would be an enormous challenge. That'd be another shoe that would drop that would be nearly unthinkable to what our supply chains need.
Look at the percentage of semiconductors from many industries that are coming out of Taiwan from 2 different locations,
Yep.
what the impact could be.
Yep.
The new facility that they're building in Northwest Phoenix that I just had a look at, it's massive. It's many times the size of a football field. Nothing coming out of it for a few years. It's not a solution in the short run.
But it is an approach in the long run.
It is an approach in the long run. And to
Yeah.
pull it back to a political side is the greatest indictment of the absence of national policy, both industrial policy and security policy, that we've allowed the semiconductor industry to be in the hands of one firm located in a location that the last time I looked at the map is not that far from China. Just
Jerry,
saying.
go ahead. Jerry, I could say should or shouldn't be doing. I'll say the first thing government should do is do no harm. And we can laugh at that. But just this week, Canada has put restrictions on truckers, unvaccinated truckers crossing the border between the US and Canada. And the US is going to do the same thing. Well, in the whole big scheme of things, truck drivers sitting largely alone in their cabs for 8 hours and possibly seeing a handful of other people as they drop off a delivery is not a huge vector of the spread of COVID. It's just not. But nonetheless, because of, let's just say, policy things, both governments have decided to have mutually reinforcing policies against unvaccinated drivers crossing the border. At this point, it does not seem like that's a pretty wise decision relative to the potential disruption in particularly, like, say, the fresh food supply chain in various places across there. So let's just say do no harm, and let's have thoughtful and measured responses all the way through all the way through the supply chains, and that's gonna help not exacerbate some of these challenges. I'll give an example from Pennsylvania. When the state of Pennsylvania locked down back again in March of 2020, the first thing they did is they said, well, we're going to close all of our rest stops on I-80, so it's not a vector of the spread of COVID. Well, guess what? Truckers use not I-80, the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They're going to close those. And it's like, well, wait a minute. That is not so wise, because we cannot close the Pennsylvania Turnpike to trucks, and people have to stop for fuel. They have to stop for restroom breaks and those kinds of things. So at least they reversed that policy quickly. But let's be sensible and thoughtful about what is the supply chain impact of any decision that the government might do.
And I'm not sure if that's a good place to end. I'm gonna give another second or two to see who else types in some interesting things. That was a great question, Jerry. Thank you. Anybody else want to do a round of closing comments?
Well, I'm going to just throw one out. I talked about pricing and how to get skills up really quick. And I just kind of, without naming names, there are two companies on the member list that worked with me. One in an area that was a very depressed, more than mature, declining industry, hasn't raised price in years. And we're looking, could they, in fact, turn an industry standard around? And we did that very easily and very quickly. And literally, and in feedback at the end, in less than a minute, 3 salespeople jumped in. Oh, let me say first, the whole sales team, who were reluctant to increase because they hadn't done it, actually said to management during the training as they learned things, wait a minute, over in this segment, we can go higher. Management, you're not going high enough. So that was a good move. But they finished with comments, never had so much confidence, never been so committed, and never felt that they had been included with the sales and marketing together to really put forward a great plan. So great results. On another ISBM member, to be nameless, I've worked with them across the years, so they've done the basics. They were in a more advanced stage, and they were actually before November thinking things were going down, we're going south, and they wanted advanced work on how to get ahead of pricing going down. And we did the scenarios and whatnot, and what we come out with, price going back up because we had over dramatized how bad it could get, and then we realized we still had power. So lots of things your members are doing to really take advantage of the ISBM membership to get places.
One quick question that came in, Brent, is it different if you just looked at companies that had a complete domestic supply versus those that had to bring things in? Is it any different at all?
I'll say yes, it's different, but it's complex. One of the things that's maybe undersold in this whole thing is the impact on smaller businesses. So things like, let's just say a local brewery, for example, the classic domestic small business, they're running in shortages of bottles and cans. They just can't get them. And some of those can suppliers are in the United States. So there's a lot of huge challenges in there. Of course, if you're importing things, it's going to be more complicated because your supply chain is longer and more complicated. But it's way more difficult to manage a supply chain in this environment, international or domestic. It probably doesn't matter. It's just different.
Good. Okay. All right. Anyone else want a final word?
Yeah, Jim Chambers here with HWI. The only comment I have there is, I'm in charge of half of my team handles the pricing for the organization. And for our customers that were pretty attuned to our supply chain and where we get our raw materials and our inputs, we actually had pricing pushback because they knew we were domestic sourced and we owned some of our own mines and things like that. So on the folks that knew we were getting raw materials from China and other ones with shortages, it was easier conversations and almost no justification needed, just keep the supply running. And supply chain really eased our job on the pricing side, right? It's when the supply chain's doing their job well and the competition is not, pricing is easier or price increases are easier. On the truly domestic stuff, we had a lot tougher conversations. So good on the supply chain.
On the domestic side, you were probably a better supplier, more on time, shorter lead times, et cetera, to your customer base. So you were probably more in demand. So you could afford to take more risk with those that weren't willing to pay you fairly for those better lead times and on-time performance. Yeah,
and that was ultimately the responses had to become pretty candid of just, we expect to be sold out, right? Do you want a spot in our operations?
Exactly.
Or not? Now there's long-term value, and you got to navigate that conversation. But that was ultimately the conversation we had to have, is just, do you want us as a supplier or not? Because we have the supply, but not for everyone out there.
Great, James.
James, it's also possible that the supply chain folks from your customers knew who they were buying with, and were raising that in response, which is the right thing for them to do as well. If they've done their due diligence about you as a supplier, they're going to give you some good pushback. At least that's what we would teach our students to do.
Sure. And some of ours is a consumable though. So, when it's being consumed in the end customer for about, 50-60% of our customers there, it's just a cost increase. But that's the world we live in, right? I mean, that's the last year of our lives. So all good stuff.
Good. Again, open mic. Anybody else? Okay, so I just want to thank this group, and also all those of you that stayed with us through the 2 hours. This has been recorded, and it will be available probably in about 24 hours or so up on our website. If you'd like, I'm going to just do a quick share screen if I can pull this back up again, and give you the addresses of the folks that were on this call. And so if you want to grab those while you can, they're up there. Feel free to reach out to us. And if you don't have time to catch it, or you somehow lose that note, that's what I do. Go back to isbm.com and just connect to us and send us drop us a note. We'll make sure we connect you with who we can. I really thank you again for everyone being with us. This has been really enlightening. Brent, I am hoping that we're not going to ask you to do this again in 6 months. That's my hope. But if it continues, we're going to do this again. So thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate it. Have a great afternoon. Stay healthy.
Thanks, Lynn.